Good morning. I'm going to read you a new story this week, and our new story is called The Lighthouse Keeper's Lunch, and it's by Rhonda and David Armitage. Now, the front cover gives us a clue about what might be happening in this story. Can you see this character just here? His name is Mr. Grinlin, and he lives in his lighthouse, but he also travels back to a little cottage with his wife, Mrs. Grinling. Now I'm going to read you the story, and then at the end I would like you to talk to your mum or your dad or your adult about what has happened in the story. Once there was a lighthouse keeper called Mr. Grinling. At night time he lived in a small white cottage perched high on the cliffs. In the daytime he rowed out to his lighthouse on the rocks to clean and polish the light. Mr. Grinlin was the most industrious lighthouse keeper. Come rain or shine, he tended to his light. Sometimes at night, as Mr. Grinlin lay sleeping in his warm bed, the ships would toot to tell him that the light was shining brightly and clearly out to sea. Each morning, while Mr. Grinlin polished the light, Mrs. Grinlin worked in the kitchen of the little white cottage on the cliffs. She was concocting a delicious lunch for him. Once she had prepared the lunch, she packed it into a special basket and clipped it onto the wire that ran all the way from the little white cottage to the lighthouse on the rocks. But one Monday something terrible happened. Mrs. Grinlin had prepared a particularly appetising lunch. She made seafood salad, a lighthouse sandwich, chicken salad, sausages and crisps, peach surprise, iced sea biscuits, some drinks and assorted fruit. She put the lunch in the basket as usual and sent it down the wire. But the lunch did not arrive. It was spotted by 3 scavenging seagulls who set upon it and devoured it with great gusto. "Clear off, you varmints!" shouted Mr. Grinlin. But the seagulls took not the slightest notice. "This is an excellent peach surprise, boys." "She's a great cook, Fred." "Scrumptious lunch, Tom." That evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grinlin decided on a plan to baffle the seagulls. "Tomorrow I shall tie the napkin to the basket," said Mrs. Grinlin. "Of course, my dear," agreed Mr. Grinlin. "A sound plan." "They'll have to try harder than this to stop us, Bert." On Tuesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grinlin racked their brains for another plan. "They are a brazen lot, those seagulls," said Mrs. Grinlin. "Brazen indeed," said Mr. Grinlin. "What shall we do?" "Our cat does not appear to like seagulls," said Mrs. Grinlin. "No, my dear," said Mr. Grinlin. "Hamish is an accomplished seagull chaser." "Of course. Tomorrow Hamish can guard the lunch." "A most ingenious plan," agreed Mr. Grinlin. Hamish did not think that this plan was ingenious at all. He spat and hissed as Mrs. Grinlin secured him in the basket. There, Hamish," said Mrs. Grinlin consolingly. "I'll have a tasty piece of herring waiting for you when you get home." Sadly, Flynn did not agree with Hamish. His fur stood on end. When the basket swayed, his whiskers dropped. And when he peered down at the wet blue sea, he felt much too sick to even notice the seagulls, let alone scare them away from the lunch. "Pretty kitty, like a piece of lobster?" This food gets better every day, Fred. Aren't you going to chase us, Kitty? Lack-a-day, lack-a-day, said Mr. Grinlin sadly. Meow, agreed Hamish pitifully. On Wednesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grinlin racked their brains again. What shall we do? Said Mr. Grinlin. Mrs. Grinlin looked thoughtful. I have it, she exclaimed. Just the mixture for hungry seagulls. Indeed, my dear, said Mr. Grinlin. What have you in mind? Wait and see, said Mrs. Grinlin. Just wait and see. Mustard sandwiches, chuckled Mr. Grinlin. A truly superb plan, my dear. Truly superb. On Thursday morning, Mrs. Grinlin carefully packed the mustard sandwiches and sent them off down the wire to the expectant seagulls. Yuck! Ah! On Friday, Mrs. Grinlin repeated the mustard mixture. All right, boys, let's go and have lunch elsewhere. It's the same as yesterday's lunch, Fred. So on Saturday, up in the little white cottage on the cliffs, a jubilant Mrs. Grinlin put away the mustard pot before she prepared the most scrumptious lunch for Mr. Grinlin. While he waited for his lunch down in the lighthouse on the rocks, Mr. Grinling sang snatches of old sea shanties as he surveyed the coastline through his telescope. And this is what he saw. He saw the seagulls on another boat. No mustard in this lot, Tom. We'll fly back here for lunch again tomorrow, boys. This is a delicious chocolate eclair, Fred. Ah, well, such is life, mused Mr. Grinlin, as he sat down to enjoy a leisurely lunch in the warm sunshine. Now, this book is all about how Mrs. Grinlin prepared lots of disgusting sandwiches to scare the seagulls away because they kept eating Mr. Grinlin's lunch. Now, what I'd like you to do today is to design your very own story map. You can listen to me read the story again and then draw pictures for each part of the story. I've prepared a story map for you if you would like a little bit of help to draw some of those pictures. I can't wait to see your story maps, and hopefully they'll look fantastic and you can draw a Mr. Grinlin just like the one on the front cover of this book.